before Yahweh's name echoed across deserts and mountaintops, before scriptures were etched and prophets anointed. The sky was already full of gods, gods with dark skin, deep eyes, and voices older than time. They were not myths, they were memory. In the beginning there were gods whose features mirrored the people who made the first drums echo, who carved temples from stone and breath, who birthed civilization with calloused hands. Their names are buried beneath centuries of silence, but their presence never left. These were the gods of Nubia, of Kemet, of Punt, of lands so ancient they defy borders. They held no Bibles, wore no crucifixes, they didn't need to. The sacred was alive in their skin, in their soil, in the way the sun rose and bowed before their altars. Imagine a world where the divine walked among the people, not as a concept, not as a distant ruler, but as kin. Amun-Ra, radiant and unseen, breathing life into each dawn. Ta, sculpting creation with the power of thought and word. Millennia before, "Let there be light" would be plagiarized into canon. Isis, the mother of magic, gathering the broken, resurrecting what was lost. Osiris, the keeper of death and rebirth, reminding all that endings were merely disguised beginnings. They were not separate from their worshippers. They were family. They were reflections. They were black, powerful, and present. But power always threatens empire, and when new orders rise, old gods must fall, or be made to fall. Enter the stage of conquest: Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome. With each regime came not only armies but agendas. And when the Hebrews began etching their identity into scrolls and covenant, Yahweh emerged, not from a void but from a battlefield of gods. He did not rise alone. He rose over the fallen. His ascent required others to be named false, foreign, or worse, demonic. A theological coup dressed in righteousness. Yet the Bible's own text betrays this truth. It whispers it between verses, mentions of Baal, of Asherah, of Molech, not idols, rivals, ancient deities once worshipped alongside Yahweh himself before monotheism marched in with a sword. Scholars who dared trace Yahweh's origins saw the fingerprints of older gods all over his name. El, the high god of Canaan, the bull-headed deity whose throne Yahweh would eventually claim. But the Hebrews didn't start with Yahweh. They grew into him. And the cost was spiritual amnesia, a forgetting not just of other gods, but of where they came from and who they truly were. This wasn't just evolution, it was erasure. And it wasn't passive, it was deliberate. To lift Yahweh to the heavens, other gods had to be dragged into hell. This is how divine monopoly is built, not by revelation, but by rewriting, by redefining what is holy and who is allowed to represent it. And black gods, those rooted in earth, in balance, in community, posed too much of a threat. They didn't demand submission. They offered reflection. They offered connection without clergy, without chains. They were too powerful to leave standing. So temples were torn down, myths recast as madness, statues defaced, scrolls burned. The gods who bore the faces of black ancestors became taboo, their memory demonized until even their children feared their names. And that fear lingers. It seeps into churches where African drums are banned, into sermons where darkness is always evil and light is always white, into the very fabric of modern faith where the divine image looks less like the motherland and more like the colonizer. But memory has its own resurrection. Beneath the rubble, beneath the lies, the gods stir. Their names begin to echo again in dreams, in research, in the broken hearts of people who feel disconnected from the God they were told to worship. They ask questions, they feel the pull, and the story begins again. not with Yahweh, but with those who came before him, who shaped the world he claimed and whose shadows still stretch long across his throne. The black gods did not disappear. They were pushed, silenced, dismantled piece by piece. But silence is not death. And if you listen closely, if you unlearn just enough, you'll hear them calling again. And this time they will not be ignored. Before the desert gave rise to the thunderous proclamations of a jealous God, there was a time when the divine was plural, harmonious, and profoundly black. The black gods did not reign from a single throne. They flowed through rivers, danced in storms, and breathed in the warmth of fire. The ancients did not look up to find God. They looked inward, outward, around them. The divine was not trapped in heaven, it walked with them, through them, as them. In this world, spiritual power was not centralized in a single voice. It resonated through thousands of tones, each god an expression of nature, humanity, and cosmic law. In this age, no priest needed to mediate between man and divinity. No scripture was gate-kept by scribes seeking influence. The black gods were known not by doctrine but by rhythm, by the pulse of the drum, the whisper of wind, the tears shed over soil. These were the gods of balance, of reciprocity, gods who gave as much as they were honored. And when they corrected, it was not through punishment but through realignment. To live in alignment with them was to live in right relationship with earth, body, ancestor, and time. These gods were not distant. They were daily, felt, intimate. They were everything Yahweh was eventually claimed to be. But without hierarchy, without fear, without erasure. Think of Ma'at, not as a goddess, but as a principle older than commandment, truth, justice, balance measured against the feather of your soul. Think of Heru, falcon-eyed and sky-soaring, embodying divine royalty and the warrior's path. Think of Seishat, goddess of wisdom, record-keeper of destinies long before biblical scribes copied the idea. These weren't abstract deities, they were spiritual functions, and they belonged to a civilization that thrived for thousands of years before the Torah was whispered on mountaintops. A civilization black in blood, black in soil, black in spirit, and unashamed of it. But that's exactly why the spiritual system that emerged later could not coexist with them. The God of the Hebrews did not merely seek worship. He sought dominance. He did not whisper balance. He thundered submission. And so when Yahweh's story began to spread, it did not spread alongside these other gods. It consumed them. Where Yahweh demanded exclusivity, the black gods celebrated coexistence. Where he called difference blasphemy, they saw it as divine diversity. And for the ancient world, that difference meant everything. One was a garden, the other, a throne room with only one seat. The rise of Yahweh meant not just theological change, but spiritual conquest. A God who would not share space, a God who destroyed the altars of others, who commanded his followers to tear down groves, burn temples, silence names. The shift from polytheism to monotheism was not evolution, it was invasion. A campaign of spiritual genocide waged not only against deities but against the cultures that birthed them, especially the black ones. And so the divine tapestry, once rich with color and sound, became muted, flattened into a singular voice. But in that flattening, something essential was lost. The gods who represented fertility, healing, sacred sexuality, the womb, the sky, the stars, they were labeled demons or delusions. Their rituals branded as witchcraft. Their worshippers branded as savages. And their names disappeared from the lips of their descendants, not by forgetting but by force. Yet the legacy of these black gods survived in fragments, hidden in customs, preserved in symbols, carried in the bones of songs that never died. The Yoruba Orisha, the Fonvodin, the Congo Nkisi, all hold remnants of that ancient relationship with the divine. Yahweh's name may have climbed to global prominence, but he stood atop a pile of broken altars, silenced spirits, and stolen thrones. And it is time to ask, who were the gods he replaced? What truths did they hold that had to be buried to make room for one? Because when you begin to trace the roots of the world's dominant religions, you will find a trail of blood and ash leading back to temples of black stone, filled with the names of gods whose power came not from fear but from union. And once you see that, you begin to understand not just history but what was stolen from the soul of the world. The black gods were not shadows of Yahweh. Yahweh was a shadow of them, and their light is returning. To understand the erasure of the black gods, you must first accept a hard truth. The war was never just about belief. It was about control. Theology was the weapon, but power was the prize. When Yahweh was elevated above all, it wasn't because his truth outshined others. It was because his priests knew how to craft a weapon out of narrative. A god becomes powerful when people are told there is no alternative. A deity becomes sovereign when every rival is outlawed, demonized, or forgotten. And this is exactly what happened to the black gods. They were outmaneuvered by empire, not outloved by people. Imagine a world where entire pantheons existed without shame, where the gods looked like their followers, where women could be priestesses of Isis and men could walk the path of Anubis with honor. These were not just belief systems, they were identities. They formed the roots of civilization. But when empires arrived, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Roman, they didn't come simply to conquer land. They came to conquer spirit. They knew that to own the body, you must first own the soul. And so they rewrote the heavens. And Yahweh, increasingly jealous, increasingly singular, became the mascot of a new order, an order that required obedience, hierarchy, and uniformity. This transition was brutal. It wasn't philosophical, it was physical. Temples were smashed, statues defiled, sacred groves burned to cinders. And when the Hebrews rose with Yahweh as their banner, they brought with them a declaration of spiritual supremacy. Read the Old Testament closely. You won't find negotiations between Yahweh and the old gods. You'll find slaughter. You'll find divine commands to destroy every altar, every image, every priest of the gods of the land. This wasn't divine enlightenment, it was theological colonization. The Canaanites, the Phoenicians, the Moabites, the Cushites, all peoples whose gods shared roots with African traditions, were painted as villains, idolaters, enemies of truth. But dig deeper and you'll find that these villains worshipped gods with deep ties to the land, to the mother, to balance. Asherah, the divine feminine, was once venerated alongside Yahweh in Israel's early temples. Archaeologists have found inscriptions, Yahweh and his Asherah. But this was inconvenient. You can't have a god who loves if you want a god who rules alone. So Asherah was erased, her statues smashed, her memory buried. And what of the other black gods? Osiris became a myth, not a truth. Anubis became a symbol of evil, not of transition. The Orisha were cast as demons. The Loa were ridiculed. The ancestral gods of Africa were stripped of their sacredness and dressed in horror, made to look like villains in someone else's story. But why? Because a monotheistic structure needs villains. It needs to define itself against the other. And what better other than the ancient gods of black lands, gods who didn't demand submission but offered harmony. The war against the black gods wasn't waged on equal ground. It was carried out through empire, through sword and scroll, through conquest disguised as righteousness. The gods who represented community, fertility, death and rebirth, cosmic law and balance. They didn't fade because they failed. They were pushed into the margins by those who feared the freedom they offered. Because when people have direct access to the divine, they can't be easily ruled. They don't need temples, they don't need priests, they don't need permission to speak to the sacred. This terrified those who built power structures around Yahweh. It still does. That's why even today, anything outside of this mold is deemed witchcraft, heresy, or evil. Not because it is, but because it is uncontrollable. And so the divine war rages on. Not in temples, but in the hearts of those who feel that their spirituality is deeper than what they've been taught. You may not remember the names of the black gods, but your soul does. And that memory is dangerous to those who built altars on erasure, but it is sacred to those ready to rise. Yahweh did not emerge in a spiritual vacuum. His rise took place on land already vibrating with sacred names, cosmic rhythms, and black divinities etched into memory and stone, before Yahweh was worshipped in the hills of Canaan. Gods and goddesses had already walked those lands for thousands of years. These gods were not forgotten because they were weak. They were suppressed because they stood in the way. Yahweh's ascension was not a spontaneous spiritual awakening, it was a conquest. And like all conquests, it needed to plant its flag where others had already built homes. Canaan, the promised land of the Hebrew Bible, was no blank slate. It was a spiritual crossroads where African, Mesopotamian, and Levantine traditions intertwined. Baal was worshipped here. El was worshipped here. Asherah, Anat, and Astarte were worshipped here. Some of these gods had dark skin, braided hair, and features mirroring the black peoples of nearby Cush and Kemet. Their rituals honored nature, sexuality, the womb, and the underworld. They were not idols of wood and stone, they were complex spiritual entities that governed life with compassion and consequence. But when Yahweh entered the scene, there was no coexistence. There was war. Tear down their altars, the Hebrew scriptures demand. Destroy their sacred poles. Put to death anyone who worships another god. This wasn't spirituality. It was spiritual genocide. It was the annihilation of a world where the divine was plural and interconnected, where women could lead, where blackness was sacred, not suspect. Yahweh did not just replace these gods. He declared them false, detestable, an abomination. And in doing so, he demanded that his followers not only forget their ancestors, but condemn them. This is how a god becomes a king, not by healing the people, but by eliminating his rivals. Yahweh's path to supremacy was paved with the crushed bones of older gods, and behind that destruction was a powerful political machinery. Prophets became enforcers, priests became gatekeepers. Sacred texts were edited and re-edited to erase any trace of what came before. By the time the Bible was solidified, the black gods had already been pushed underground, their names scratched from history by scribes who knew the power they still carried. But history has cracks, and through those cracks, truth always finds a way. Scholars have uncovered Yahweh's early connections to older deities, his shared traits with El, the high god of Canaan, his possible roots in Midianite traditions where his earliest followers may have been African nomads. In ancient inscriptions, Yahweh is depicted not as the almighty creator, but as a storm god, a warrior, a tribal protector. His mythology was built over time, constructed layer by layer, absorbing and erasing as needed. And each time a rival god was forgotten, Yahweh's shadow grew longer. Even within the Bible itself, there are remnants, clues that Yahweh was not always alone. Let us make man in our image. Who is us? Why does Yahweh speak in plural? Why does Genesis echo older Mesopotamian and Egyptian creation stories nearly word for word? Why does Moses, raised in Egypt, create a priesthood so similar to that of Osiris and Ptah? The fingerprints of the black gods are everywhere, if you know where to look. This story is not about disproving Yahweh. It's about exposing how his rise was built on the bones of others, gods who spoke to the hearts of their people, gods whose skin was dark like the soil they sprung from, gods who offered power without punishment, love without fear, balance without bloodshed. And those gods are not dead. Their temples may have fallen, their priests may have been silenced, but their energy remains, waiting for those with the courage to remember. Because once you realize that Yahweh was not the beginning, everything changes. The story you were told is not the story that was lived. And to reclaim your spiritual history, you must begin at the place where they told you to stop digging. Under the altar of Yahweh, there are names buried, and they are ready to rise. When the conqueror cannot kill the god, he turns the god into a demon. That is the oldest trick of spiritual warfare, and it was this exact tactic used to sever black people from their own divinities. The gods once revered for healing, protection, and fertility were painted over with horror. Their names, once whispered with reverence, were rebranded with dread. This wasn't theology. It was strategy. To strip a people of their power, you must first teach them to fear what once made them whole. And so the gods who looked like them began to look like enemies in the stories told by those who colonized their spirits. Take Anubis, the jackal-headed guardian of the dead, a god of transition, protector of the soul's journey. He was never evil. He was sacred. But through the lens of Western distortion, he became a symbol of death in the most sinister sense. The jackal face that once meant comfort in the afterlife was recast as monstrous. The same goes for the Orisha of the Yoruba, powerful forces of nature who governed rivers, lightning, love, and war. Oya, the goddess of storms, became a witch. Eshu, the divine messenger and trickster, was likened to the devil himself. And Shango, the thunderous embodiment of justice and power, was painted with the same brush used to terrify children into obedience. This demonization wasn't random. It was targeted. Because these gods offered direct connection. No church, no priest, no sacred book required. They whispered in dreams. They stirred in the earth. They spoke through drum beats and possession and ritual. And so they had to be silenced. Not through debate, but through fear. Colonizers arrived with Bibles in one hand and chains in the other, and both were used to break the link between Africans and their gods. Your ancestors were pagans. Your traditions are evil. Your gods are demons. These weren't teachings. They were psychological weapons, and many believed them. Not out of faith, but out of survival. To call on your gods became dangerous. To dance your ancestral dances could cost your life. So people hid their gods in plain sight. They renamed them, disguised them as saints, wove their rituals into Christian liturgy. This is how syncretism was born, not from confusion but resistance. In Cuba, Haiti, Brazil, Trinidad, anywhere Africans were taken in bondage, the black gods never died. They just put on new clothes. Yet the trauma of demonization remained. It lingered in the subconscious. It echoed in the churches where black skin was welcomed, but black gods were not. It crept into the language. Black magic, dark forces, evil spirits, always associating darkness with danger, always separating the sacred from the skin it was born in. But if you trace the roots of these demons, you'll find divinity. You'll find the mother who heals with herbs, the father who chants over fire, the elder who knows the names of the river spirits. You'll find a people who were never broken, only hidden. And now the veil is lifting. People are asking questions. They're unlearning the fear. They're lighting candles, not to saints, but to the names that came before. They are remembering that a God is not demonic because he speaks your language or wears your face. A God is not evil because he was born on your land. These black gods were never the enemy. They were the first allies, the ones who walked with your ancestors before Yahweh was ever carved into stone. The demonization of black gods was never about truth. It was about control. And the antidote to control is remembrance. When you remember who your gods were, you remember who you are. And when that memory returns, the chains of fear begin to fall, not just from your faith, but from your identity. Because the God who looks like you does not want your fear. He wants your power. She wants your voice. And they are listening still. Wherever you find monotheism asserting dominance, you will find a trail of erased goddesses behind it. And in the case of Yahweh, this erasure was surgical. Not only was the divine feminine silenced, it was demonized, hidden, and replaced. The black goddesses who once ruled alongside their male counterparts were stripped of their crowns and recast as temptresses, whores, or heretics. The story of Yahweh's supremacy is not only the story of gods replacing gods, it's the story of masculinity choking divinity. It's the story of the womb being shut out of the temple. In the ancient African world, the divine was always both, male and female, sun and moon, earth and sky. Isis was not beneath Osiris. She resurrected him. Ma'at did not obey. She governed cosmic law. In Kemet, the feminine wasn't an accessory to the divine. She was half of it, sometimes more. She was the soil from which power grew, the breath that gave the spirit direction. But when Yahweh rose, the God who demanded exclusive worship had no room for a goddess beside him. Power to be complete had to be male, and that meant the feminine had to be banished. Asherah was the first casualty. She was worshipped as the consort of El, the sky god of Canaan, and early Israelite communities revered her as the mother of life. Archaeological evidence confirms this. Inscriptions found on ancient pottery read, "Blessed be Yahweh and his Asherah." But such a partnership was intolerable to later priests. Yahweh could not be a husband, he had to be a ruler. Asherah's statues were torn down, her groves burned, her name scratched out. She became the unspoken, the divine woman made into silence. And what happens when the sacred feminine is erased from divinity? Women are erased from power. Their voices vanish from the altar. Their stories vanish from the scrolls. Eve becomes the sinner. Mary becomes the virgin. Lilith becomes a demon. The message is clear. Femininity is dangerous unless it is obedient. But before Yahweh's revisions, the feminine was not a threat. She was the earth itself, the one who births, the one who nourishes, the one who remembers. In African traditions, this feminine principle lived in every cosmology. In the Yoruba pantheon, you find Oshun, the river goddess of sweetness and power. In the Fawn tradition, you find Mawu, the moon goddess, co-creator of the universe. These were not secondary figures. They were essential forces. Their waters washed the soul. Their blood echoed the tides. Their magic was not manipulation. It was balance, healing, order. But in a patriarchal theology, balance is a threat. Because balance decentralizes power, it redistributes holiness. If a goddess can create life, she doesn't need a priest to tell her what God wants. If the feminine is divine, then control begins to slip. And so the sacred feminine had to be scrubbed from the story, not because she was powerless, but because she was too powerful. And still she endured. You can find her in the rituals that survived the flames, in the songs whispered from mother to daughter, in the lullabies that echo in the fields, in the unnamed saints whose iconography still bears her face. She lives in the intuition that rises when truth is spoken, in the gut that knows when a story has been altered, in the pulse that beats faster when her name is called in secret. To remember the black gods is to remember the black goddesses. To resurrect one without the other is to repeat the very split that enslaved us. Because the divine was never meant to be a single throne occupied by a jealous king. It was a council, a rhythm, a harmony. And until we restore her name, her face, her presence, we are still bowing to an incomplete God. The return of the feminine is not about worshiping women. It's about healing the fracture in the divine image itself. It's about reclaiming the full expression of spirit, fluid, cyclical, wild, wise. And it starts when we speak her name again. Because the God who created you in his image was only half the story, and the other half is rising. When a God says, "You shall have no other gods before me," it isn't just a spiritual warning. It's a political declaration. Yahweh's jealousy, so often framed as a divine attribute, was the language of conquest. It wasn't about holiness, it was about monopoly. And to understand how Yahweh rose to become the central deity of an entire civilization, you must recognize that his ascension mirrored that of a rising kingdom, not a spirit. A kingdom that needed loyalty, obedience, and a God who reflected the ambitions of men, not the wisdom of the cosmos. Jealousy is not the nature of the infinite. It is the tactic of those who fear competition. The ancient black gods did not ask for exclusive worship. They didn't need it. Their power was embedded in the balance of all things. They coexisted. They functioned together. Anubis walked the soul into the underworld while Mahat judged its truth. Isis healed what was broken while Thoth recorded what was true. Shango ruled thunder while Oshun ruled sweetness. Each had their domain. Each honored the others, but Yahweh demanded something different. He didn't just ask for devotion, he demanded singular allegiance. And when you look closer, that demand wasn't spiritual. It was strategic. Because Yahweh didn't rise in a vacuum of belief, he rose in a context of empire building. The Hebrew people, once nomads, began to unify. Their identity as a people became entangled with their God. Yahweh became the symbol of a rising nation. And like any kingdom, that nation needed a singular banner. Monotheism wasn't born from revelation. It was born from consolidation. The prophets of Israel were not just spiritual messengers, they were architects of a new national identity. They warned not just against sin, but against other gods. And not because those gods were false, but because they were a threat to unity. Worship of Baal, of Asherah, of Moloch, these weren't just spiritual rivalries, they were political fault lines. The rise of Yahweh required the fall of others, and the best way to ensure that fall was to call it blasphemy. So the Hebrew scriptures were constructed carefully, line by line, law by law, to sever the people from the gods of their neighbors and from the gods of their own past. Yahweh wasn't always the only God. Early Hebrew texts admit this. Who is like you among the gods, O Yahweh? A question that only makes sense if other gods are acknowledged. But as time passed, those verses were reinterpreted. The theology became stricter, more rigid, and eventually Yahweh became the only one allowed to exist. This wasn't holiness, it was spiritual colonization, and the people obeyed, not always from love but from fear. The fear of punishment, the fear of exile, the fear of being cut off not just from the temple but from the community. The fear of being accused of idolatry, of witchcraft, of betrayal. It was a fear that mirrored the tactics of empire. And it worked. Because fear always works until it doesn't. The black gods were not lost because they lacked power. They were lost because their people were forced to choose between their gods and their lives, between memory and survival. And over time, that fear buried memory. That fear dressed itself in righteousness, and that fear still lingers in pulpits, in doctrine, in the eyes of those afraid to question what they were taught. But fear is not eternal. Truth survives, and now, people are beginning to see that Yahweh's jealousy was never about your soul. It was about your allegiance. It was about cutting you off from any source of spiritual identity that could not be controlled. It was about replacing your ancestral gods with a single figure who mirrored the ambitions of king, not the balance of creation. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Because divine love does not require erasing others, but empire does. What if the holy book you were told to build your life on was never intended to liberate you? What if it was a weapon, not of faith, but of empire? The Bible, for all its beauty and wisdom, is not a pure beam of divine light untouched by human hands. It is a curated collection, assembled by councils, translated by kings, edited by theologians, and filtered through the agendas of men who knew exactly what they wanted it to be. And what they wanted was control. What they feared was the memory of the gods that came before Yahweh, especially the black ones. From Genesis to Revelation, the Bible tells a powerful story. But what most people never ask is, what stories were left out? What voices were silenced? What traditions were demonized to make this one narrative supreme? Because every canon is a choice, every inclusion is an exclusion, and the Bible we hold today is not the full story. It is the surviving version of a war between the sacred and the sanctioned, the apocryphal books, the Gnostic Gospels, the ancient scrolls buried in the sands. They all tell of a deeper, messier, more plural spirituality, one where the divine was accessible without church, without priest, without Yahweh, one where the divine lived in symbols, in stars, in breath. And within those banned books, you'll find whispers of the old gods, of cosmologies that don't begin with "let there be light," but with vibrations, with water, with womb, of creators who looked nothing like the God of the Israelites and everything like the ancestors of Africa. Even within the Bible itself, the signs of manipulation are glaring. Why does the Bible speak of gods in the plural? Let us make man in our image, and never explain who us is. Why are figures like Melchizedek and Enoch elevated and then abandoned? Why are the feminine, the mystical, the dark-skinned so often associated with danger? It's because the editors of Scripture were not just telling stories, they were shaping perception. And perception is power. They made Yahweh the center not because he was the only God, but because he was the most useful one. His laws supported order. His anger justified punishment. His exclusivity allowed leaders to say, "Obey me or disobey God." And once that idea was locked into a book sealed with divine authority, it became nearly impossible to question. Because to question the book was to question God, and to question God was heresy. But the cracks are visible. The inconsistencies pile up. The archaeological evidence tells a different story than the text. The ancient altars discovered in Canaan show Yahweh and Asherah worshipped side by side. The Psalms mirror Egyptian hymns. Proverbs echo African wisdom tradition. And the Exodus narrative, so central to Hebrew identity, parallels older Mesopotamian epics. The Bible, it turns out, is not a beginning. It is a remix, a spiritual collage with chapters missing, pages burned, meanings mistranslated, and gods buried beneath footnote. And if the Bible is not neutral, then neither is its silence. Its refusal to name the black gods it replaced is not accidental, it is tactical. Because to name them is to acknowledge them, and to acknowledge them is to admit that Yahweh was not the first. That there were others, older, darker, wiser. Gods who did not need temples to be real, who did not need books to be remembered, but we are remembering anyway. Because truth has a heartbeat, and that heartbeat sounds like the drums they tried to silence. It sounds like the stories whispered by grandmothers who never needed a Bible to know the divine. It sounds like your soul pulling you toward something ancient, something that was once called heresy but is in truth home. So if the Bible was never neutral, then neither is your awakening. Because to read between its lines is not betrayal, it is resurrection, not of doctrine, but of memory. When you close your eyes and picture God, what do you see? A white man with flowing robes, a face gentle yet stern, with pale skin, blue eyes, and long brown hair. That image did not come from divine vision. It came from a brush held by European hands. The face of God you were given was not a reflection of spiritual truth. It was a reflection of power. The colonizers didn't just bring swords and Bibles. They brought portraits, and through those portraits they rewrote the face of the divine. The God of the Bible may have been born in the ancient East, but he was recast in the image of the West. This wasn't coincidence. It was colonization, not just of land, not just of bodies, but of spirit. Because once you convince a people that God looks like their oppressor, you have conquered more than their home. You've conquered their hope, their sense of sacred self, their ability to see divinity in their own reflection. If God is white, then white becomes holy, and black becomes everything else, sinful, dark, inferior, damned. That's not just racism, that's spiritual violence. The ancient black gods never looked like this. They wore the crowns of Nubia, the melanin of the Nile, the features of ancestors who built pyramids with science and soul. Osiris was painted with green or black skin, not to represent evil but fertility, life, and rebirth. Anubis, jet black, was the guardian of the soul's passage to the afterlife. Isis, deep brown and regal, cradled creation in her arms. These were gods you could see yourself in, gods that made you feel seen. But the rise of Yahweh and later Christianity came with an erasure of these images, and then in the Renaissance that erasure was painted in full color. Artists like Michelangelo gave Jesus the face of European nobility. Mary became a pale-skinned maiden. Angels sprouted golden curls and ivory wings. These paintings didn't reflect history, they rewrote it. They encoded the supremacy of whiteness into the very structure of heaven. And so for centuries, black people worshipped a God who looked nothing like them. They prayed to a savior who bore the features of their enslavers. They were told to deny their ancestral spirits, to burn their sacred symbols, to cut their hair, to speak the colonizer's tongue, not just in life but in prayer. And when they cried out for liberation, they were handed scriptures that taught submission. But deep within, the soul remembers. It remembers the gods with dark skin and radiant light. It remembers the dances around fire, the rituals beneath the moon, the voices of ancestors who never needed to kneel in pews to touch the divine. It remembers a time when God was not white, was not male, was not distant, but black, balanced and near. And now, That memory is rising. Black artists are painting gods in their own image. Black scholars are uncovering the roots of faith in African soil. Black children are learning that the divine doesn't need blue eyes to be beautiful, that God can look like their father, their mother, their reflection in the mirror. The face of God was painted to control you. But you do not have to accept that canvas. You can repaint it, reclaim it, remember it. You can tell your spirit that the divine wears your skin, speaks your language, dances your rhythms. And once you do, the chains fall, not from your wrists but from your vision, because the truth is the divine never had one face. But for you, it always had yours. They say God scattered the people at Babel for trying to reach the heavens, that their unified voice threatened divine order. But what if that story wasn't a warning against arrogance? What if it was a cover for something far older and far more dangerous to those in power? What if the true fear was not the tower's height but the people's unity? Their one language, their one rhythm, their rising vibration. Because when people remember how to speak together, how to build together, they remember how to create like God. The story of the Tower of Babel has been used to explain linguistic division, cultural fragmentation, the birth of confusion. But beneath that myth lies a deeper truth. Collective power is divine, and the people of Babel had it. Not just technological genius, but spiritual synchronicity. They were building more than a tower, they were building a bridge between heaven and earth, between the seen and unseen, between the human and the divine. In African cosmology, there was no fear of ascension. The Dogon people mapped the stars without telescopes. The Kemetic mystery schools taught that man could rise not just spiritually, but metaphysically. The body was a temple, the tongue a spell, the soul a stairway. Ascension was the point. But Yahweh's version of the divine didn't leave room for that. In his domain there was one ladder, and only angels climbed it. Humans were meant to kneel, to obey, to wait. So Babel had to fall, not just the story, but in our psyche. We had to be taught that unity was dangerous, that reaching higher was rebellion, that to question was to sin. And so we were divided by language, by doctrine, by race, by nation, by denomination. The spiritual tongue that once connected us to the source was broken into shards, and each shard was labeled holy only if it bowed to the jealous God at the center. But that's not how the black gods taught us. In the ancient temples of Africa, knowledge was shared through vibration, through chant, through geometry and light. The ancients knew that sound could move matter, that intention could shape destiny, that harmony could shift reality. They did not fear the people rising together, they facilitated it. Every ritual was a chorus, every dance a dialect, every circle a sacred agreement to become something greater than the sum of its parts. The story of Babel isn't about God stopping a tower. It's about men stopping a memory, the memory that we were once one. That we spoke the language of energy, that we built bridges not to challenge God, but to meet the divine halfway. That the gods did not demand separation, but celebrated synthesis. And perhaps that's why the old gods were buried. Because they didn't need temples. They made the body the altar. They didn't need priests. They made wisdom communal. They didn't need permission. They moved when the people sang. And that kind of spirituality is hard to control. It doesn't fit in books or creeds. It erupts, it heals, it liberates. Now that unity is returning, slowly, in whispers, in music that transcends borders, in movements that resist division, in the deep knowing that we are not meant to worship in isolation, but to rise in unison. And as that unity rebuilds, so too does the tower. Not a structure of stone, but a vibration of remembering, of black gods and brown gods, of feminine gods and formless ones, of every aspect of divinity that Yahweh's priests tried to suppress. Because the tower wasn't the problem. The forgetting was. And now, brick by brick, soul by soul, we are rebuilding the truth. Together. They didn't just conquer with words, they didn't just rewrite the stories, they lit the fires, burned the temples, set the scrolls ablaze, and with each flame they declared, "Your gods are dead, your ways are over, our God is the only one." But fire doesn't just destroy, it leaves behind ash. And in that ash, fragments, memories, truths that refuse to die. Because you can burn the books, but you can't burn the stars. You can melt the statues, but you can't erase the sky. Across the ancient world, sacred knowledge was once written in the heavens. The Dogon people mapped Sirius B without telescopes. The Egyptians aligned pyramids to Orion's belt. The Nubians carved calendars into stone to track the breath of the cosmos. Every constellation told a story. Every planet was a god, and every night sky was a reminder that we came from more than dust, we came from design. But when Yahweh's dominance spread, his followers feared the sky, not because they didn't understand it, but because they understood it too well. They knew the sky was a library and their God had no pages there. The stars spoke of gods older than Abraham, deities born before Eden, stories that couldn't be confined to Genesis. And so they turned astronomy into astrology, astrology into heresy, and heresy into firewood. They banned what they couldn't claim, burned what they couldn't control. The Library of Alexandria, reduced to smoke, the scrolls of Kemet desecrated, the oral traditions of African priests erased by missionary tongues, all in the name of the one God who said, "Thou shalt have no other before me." But beneath that commandment was fear, because if the people remembered how to read the sky, they'd stop needing to read the Bible. If they remembered the gods who spoke in wind, in drumbeat, in dream, they'd stop kneeling to the throne built on fear. Fire became their language. Crusades in Europe, witch burnings, colonial torchings of sacred grounds in Africa and the Americas. Fire doesn't just kill, it terrorizes. It sends a message, forget, or we will make you forget. But they underestimated the resilience of memory, the way a grandmother's song can carry secret, the way a child's dream can echo ancient myths, the way symbols resurface uninvited generation after generation. Yahweh's followers used fire to rewrite the sky, but the sky did not consent. The stars never bowed. They still shine with the stories of the Black God, of Ozar's death and resurrection, of Oset's magic, of the Sirius cycle and its connection to floods and fertility. The knowledge lives on, not because it was protected, but because it was true. And now, in a time when science and spirit begin to speak again, the stars are calling louder. People are rediscovering the language of the heavens, the way energy pulses through constellations, the way your birth chart can reveal what religion tried to bury. And with every chart read, with every ritual under a full moon, with every drumbeat aligned to a cosmic rhythm, the gods return. Not as idols, but as frequencies, forces, archetypes too vast to fit in a doctrine. The fire they used to erase the sky only delayed the truth. It could not destroy it. Because the real temples were never made of stone. They were made of vibration, of breath, of you. And the sky, still alive with memory, waits for your eyes to rise, to remember, to trace the stars that Yahweh's fire could never reach. While the people bowed to Yahweh, the priests sat on invisible thrones, Robed in supposed holiness, they claimed to speak for the divine, but they spoke in riddles shaped by empire. It was never about God. It was about access. Who could speak to the divine and who couldn't? Who could interpret the laws and who must obey without question? And so the priesthood became a gatekeeper, not of heaven, but of power. They did not serve Yahweh. They used him. In the ancient world, spiritual knowledge was open. In Kemet, temples were schools. In Nubia, priests were scientists, astronomers, healers, mystics. Spiritual mastery was not hoarded, it was taught. But Yahweh's system flipped that upside down. Access to God became centralized. Sacred texts became secret. Only priests could enter the Holy of Holies. Only they could pronounce the divine name. Only they could perform the ritual. The divine became property and the priests were the landlords. It was never just about faith. It was about structure, hierarchy, control. The priesthood decided what sins were forgivable, what sacrifices were acceptable, what knowledge could be shared. They wrote the laws that served their class and punished the rest. And they told the people it was the will of God, that questioning them was rebellion not against man, but against Yahweh himself. In doing so, they created the most powerful illusion of all. Spiritual tyranny masked as divine order. And through that illusion they ruled, not through armies but through fear, not through crowns but through scripture. They had no need for weapons when they had your soul trembling before them. And they ensured the people remained ignorant, burning alternative texts, silencing rival voices, executing mystics, branding every other spiritual system as witchcraft, paganism, or demonic. The gods of Kemet, of Cush, of Ethiopia, reduced to threats instead of teachers. Reduced to demons. This priestly empire lasted for centuries, and it was adopted far beyond ancient Israel. The Christian Church inherited it. The Vatican perfected it. The pastors of today echo it. You see it in the pulpits that forbid questions, in the sermons that shame intuition, in the preachers who demand tithes while quoting texts that enslave. These are not spiritual leaders, they are inheritors of a system designed to block your direct access to the divine. A system that must make you feel small so it can feel sacred. But the black gods never needed priests. They taught that spirit lives within, that every person is a temple, that no man needs permission to enter the sacred. The rituals of the old ways were open. Initiation was earned through inner work, not granted through robe. You didn't need to confess to a priest, you needed to confess to your... And the gods heard you because they were not watching from afar. They were breathing through you. The priesthood feared this, because a people who can commune with the divine directly cannot be controlled. A people who remember that the divine speaks through dreams, through drums, through DNA, will never again kneel before a preacher who sells salvation. That's why the system still fights to keep you blind, why it mocks ancestral wisdom, why it tells you meditation is dangerous, why it fears the feminine, why it fears the dark. Because the moment you reclaim your own connection, the throne of the priest crumbles. And it is crumbling. Quietly, surely, because more people are realizing they were never meant to bow at altars built by gatekeepers. They were meant to rise into the sacred that was always theirs. No middleman, no fear, just you, the ancestors, and the divine, unfiltered. They told you to fear your ancestors, that pouring libations was witchcraft, that calling their names was necromancy, that dreaming of them meant you were cursed. But before colonization, before conversion, before the Bible was ever placed in your hand, your ancestors were your first line of prayer. Your connection to the divine ran through their blood, their wisdom, their memory. You didn't fear them, you honored them. until the system needed them erased. You see, once Yahweh's empire spread, there was no room for spirits that didn't obey him. And your ancestors, those fierce, black, radiant beings who walked with gods older than time, did not bow to Yahweh. They whispered the names of Auset and Ausar, invoked Ogun and Obatala, danced for Yamaya, dreamed with the spirits of the trees, the waters, the sun. They lived in rhythm with the world, and that rhythm was power. It was sovereignty, it was memory. So the priesthood, the colonizers, the missionaries, they declared war on the dead. Not because the ancestors were evil, but because they remembered too much. Because they carried the old codes, the forgotten names, the sacred formula. Because they were proof that divinity was not found only in books, but in bones. And so to sever you from them, they renamed them. Familiar spirits, demons, unclean. They burned the drums that called them, banned the tongues that prayed to them, replaced ancestral altars with wooden crosses, and told you your grandmother's rituals were damnable. And generation after generation, that fear settled in, until you began to flinch at your own dream, until you began to silence the names that once protected you, until you believed that to love your ancestors was to betray God. But here's what they didn't tell you. You were never meant to worship the dead. You were meant to remember them. Because in remembering them, you remember who you are, where you came from, what sacred blood runs through your veins. You remember that the gifts you carry, your intuition, your dreams, your knowing, aren't accidents. They are inheritance. The whisper in your chest, that's them. The gut feeling that saved you, that's them. The tears that came out of nowhere while staring at the stars, them. They never left you, they couldn't, because they are tied to you through more than memory, through frequency, through blood, through light. But the system needed you to forget. Because when you remember your ancestors, you stop looking up for God, and you start looking within. You stop praying to a sky that stays silent and start listening to the voices that have always spoken from your bones. The black gods never told you to abandon your lineage. They stood with your ancestors, fought with them, died with them, rose with them. And your ancestors, those midwives of miracles, kept the flame of the old ways alive through lullabies, through stories, through silence. They passed it to you even if you didn't know it. And now the flame is flickering again. This is why your dreams are getting louder, why your childhood memories are resurfacing, why old songs suddenly move you to tears. It's not random. It's resurrection. Your ancestors are knocking, not to haunt you, but to heal you, to remind you that you are not alone, that you come from people who knew how to call down rain and speak to the wind, that you are the answer to a prayer whispered centuries ago beneath a full moon. They feared your ancestors because they could not colonize the dead, but you can honor them, and in doing so, you reclaim what no doctrine could ever kill. You reclaim your soul's inheritance. It was never just about power, it was about origin. Because if blackness was divine, then black people were not meant to be slaves. If blackness was sacred, then colonization was sin. If blackness was the beginning, then everything the empire built was a lie. And so black divinity had to be forgotten. Not simply erased, but demonized, discredited, silenced with scripture, repainted with pale skin. Because memory is a threat, and divine memory, that's a revolution. In the beginning, blackness wasn't feared, it was holy. Kemet called it KMT, the black land, the fertile land, the land blessed by the Nile. In West Africa, the Orisha were not shy about their melanin. The Dogon didn't need telescopes to map the stars. Ethiopia held kingdoms before Europe knew its own name. Blackness was not a color, it was a code. a vibration of life, of magic, of truth. But when empire arrived, blackness became the enemy. Yahweh's followers didn't just bring a new God, they brought a new hierarchy, one where whiteness became light and blackness became shadow, where Eve's sin became the root of woman's blame and Ham's curse became the excuse for slavery, where the sacred drum became heathen noise and the healing circle became witchcraft. And the worst part? They didn't have to kill all the black gods, they just had to convince black people to stop believing in them. It was the psychological war that did the most damage. A Bible in one hand, a whip in the other. Teach the children that Jesus is white. Teach the women that silence is virtue. Teach the men that their strength is sinful unless it kneels. And over time, entire generations grew up loving a God who did not love them back, praying to a face that looked nothing like their ancestors, shaming the power that pulsed in their own veins. But even buried truths have roots, and those roots are breaking through again. Black divinity is not extinct, it's encoded. In the way we move, the way we sing, the way we survive. It's in the resilience of the mother who never gives up, in the visions of the child who dreams in symbols, in the rage of the man who feels the chains even when they're invisible. Black divinity is not a memory, it is a presence, a frequency that never asked for permission to exist, and that's what they fear. Not just the past, but the return. Because when you remember that the first gods looked like you, the shame dissolves, the self-hate collapses. You no longer ask for salvation, you embody it. You no longer wait for heaven, you recognize it in your skin, your breath, your walk. You stop being a worshiper of distant power and become a vessel of present truth. This is why they had to make you forget. Why history books start with slavery instead of sovereignty. Why your gods were renamed demons, why your symbols were mocked, why your tongue was cut. Because if you ever remembered that the divine once spoke your name in thunder and walked your land in shadow and flame, everything would change. And it is changing, slowly, fiercely. The black gods rise not in temples but in your heartbeat, not in myth but in motion, not in books but in being. And when you feel that rise, don't silence it, don't apologize for it. That is the sound of memory returning, of dignity reviving, of divinity reclaiming its throne in you. Obedience was the foundation, not truth, not liberation, not awakening. From the beginning, Yahweh did not ask his people to understand. He asked them to submit. Fear the Lord, the scripture said. Obey his command. Not contemplate, not question, not awaken to inner light. Just obey, and obedience when demanded without insight becomes control, becomes blindness dressed as faith, becomes silence mistaken for righteousness. And that is where awakening dies, under the weight of fear disguised as reverence. The black gods, in contrast, did not demand blind obedience. They invited transformation. They taught through initiation, through challenge, through symbolic death and rebirth. In Kemet, no one rose through ranks without facing the mirror of the soul. The path to divinity wasn't a sermon, it was a journey, a breaking, a remembering. You didn't kneel, you ascended. You didn't fear the gods, you became one with them. Because awakening was the goal, not servitude. But Yahweh's system flipped that. It made awakening dangerous. Eve was cursed for seeking knowledge. Lucifer was cast out for wanting autonomy. The tower was destroyed for aiming too high. Again and again, the message was clear. Don't reach, don't rise, don't question, just obey. And if you disobey, eternal punishment, suffering, fire. That's not divinity, that's domination. And domination thrives in the absence of awakening. Why was Yahweh so threatened by the human mind? Because an awakened people cannot be ruled. A conscious people don't need priests. A people in tune with spirit don't trade their power for promise. That's why mysticism was hunted, why Gnostics were silenced, why women were burned, why the wise were imprisoned. Not because they were wrong, but because they were awake. Yahweh's covenant was not a partnership. It was a contract with fine print. Serve me, and I'll bless you. Cross me, and I'll curse you. That's not the language of a loving creator. That's the language of a king obsessed with loyalty. But the black gods, those who breathed life into the earliest civilizations, never threatened damnation. They guided, they evolved with you. Because they were not outside of you, they were within. And when you realize that awakening is your birthright, you stop playing the role of sinner. You stop begging for mercy. You start remembering who you are. And Yahweh's system cannot survive a world where people remember. That's why it distracts with ritual, with guilt, with rules layered upon rules. So many that you forget to ask, is this even love? Is this even truth? But truth doesn't demand obedience. It demands presence. And presence is what the black gods gave. They met you in trance, in dance, in breath. They led you not to altars, but to stars, not to laws, but to liberation. Because they knew the divine does not live in chains, physical or mental. It lives in freedom, in fire, in the trembling awakening of the soul. Yahweh needed obedience to preserve his rule, but the black gods never ruled. They revealed. And what they revealed wasn't a throne to kneel before, but a path to walk, a light to find, a self to awake. You don't need obedience to be holy. You need remembrance. You need truth. You need the courage to leave behind the systems built on fear and return to the current of spirit that never needed a name. And that return has begun. You feel it, don't you? That pull, that rising, that sacred defiance in your chest that says, I will not kneel to a God who needs fear to be worshipped. That's the black gods moving through you, not demanding, just wait for you to awaken. And they always told you God was out there, distant, separate, above, watching from the sky, judging your every move. They never told you the truth, that the divine was already inside you, that the sacred lived in your breath, in your blood, in your bone. Because if you knew that, if you felt that truth burning behind your eyes, you wouldn't need temples. You wouldn't need priests. You wouldn't need fear. You'd realize you were never meant to worship. You were meant to remember. The black gods whispered this truth from the beginning. They never pointed to heavens beyond your reach. They pointed to your own body. The Kemetic saying, know thyself, wasn't metaphor. It was a map. The chakra systems of ancient Ethiopia weren't fantasy, they were anatomy. In the Congo, initiation rites didn't teach you to escape the world. They taught you to master it from the inside out. Your body was the temple, your spirit the altar, your intuition the priest. And that is what frightened Yahweh's system the most. Not rebellion, not magic, but self-realization. Because once you realize the God within, you stop playing the game. You stop confessing sins that were never yours. You stop fearing hells that were never real. You stop following rules designed to keep you small. Instead, you start expanding. You start listening to the voice that sounds like your grandmother's song, your ancestors' prayer, your own soul unchained. The empires of Yahweh thrived on disconnection, on hierarchy, on dependence. They told you that without obedience you'd be lost, that without the church you'd be damned, that without their version of salvation you were nothing. But all of it was a lie built on one critical theft, the theft of the divine from within you. They took your holiness, dressed it in foreign robes, and told you to beg for it back. But the black gods never demanded your worship. They reminded you of your birthright, of the electric pulse in your fingertips, of the visions behind your eyelids, of the healing power in your tears. You weren't meant to fear God, you were meant to become one. Not through arrogance, but through remembrance. Not through control, but through surrender to the infinite within. That's why every colonizer, every missionary, every empire that followed Yahweh's script targeted the mystics first. The oracles, the herbalists, the dancers who could summon rain, the children who saw spirits because they were dangerous. Not because they had weapons, but because they carried the old code. The proof that you didn't need a middleman to reach the sacred, the living memory that God could wear your face. And now, that memory is surfacing again, in breathwork, in plant medicine, in dreams that feel more real than waking life, in chants that move your cells, in tears you can't explain. That's not confusion, that's reactivation. The divine you forgot how to trust is calling from inside your ribs, asking, will you stop looking outward? Will you come home? You were not born to serve a throne built on fear. You were born to remember the temple inside your own chest. The God within you doesn't punish, it expands. Doesn't shame, it liberates. Doesn't demand allegiance, it invites awakening. And when that awakening comes, the false gods tremble. Because a person who remembers their own divinity cannot be controlled. This was always the threat. Not magic, not rebellion, not even history, but you. Waking up, lighting the altar of your own soul, and realizing it was never out there. It was always in here. Where the black gods dwell, where the divine still speaks, where truth cannot be colonized. They were never gone, just hidden, beneath centuries of conquest, behind veils of doctrine, under layers of shame dressed as holiness. The black gods, the ones who taught without fear, who walked barefoot in flame and rain, who carved truth into stone and spirit, were not erased. They were buried in your language, in your music, in your dreams, waiting, watching, whispering through the cracks in empire's illusion. And now, they are returning, but not like before, not with temples or armies. They're not asking for monuments. They're not demanding ritual. Their return is quiet, intimate, cellular. They are awakening inside you in the way your spine tingles when you hear their name, in the way your soul flinches when you recite words that don't feel like yours, in the way your hands shake when you realize your ancestors were not sinners, they were sovereign. This return is not a rebellion, it is a remembrance. You are not starting a new religion. You're ending a forget. Every time you light a candle with intention, they return. Every time you call your grandmother by her secret name, they return. Every time you choose intuition over indoctrination, they return. The gods don't need worship, they need witnesses, and you are the living altar they've waited for. Look around. The signs are everywhere. People waking from the trance of fear-based faith, seeking deeper truths that sound like home, realizing the Bible was edited, the history whitewashed, the miracles misnamed, seeing that every devil cast down in Scripture looked like a god their ancestors once danced for, beginning to ask the questions empire never wanted asked. Who benefits from your forgetting? And who stands to rise when you remember? This is why the return was always inevitable. Because truth cannot stay buried forever. It grows roots. It cracks the concrete. It moves through generations disguised as instinct. You are not discovering the black gods. You are reuniting with them. They are not foreign. They are familiar. That warmth in your chest when you hear the names Auset, Ogun, Thoth, Yamai, that's not curiosity. That's recognition. But this return isn't about going back. It's about integrating, about realizing that the sacred doesn't live in the past. It lives in your present awareness. You don't need to dress like an ancient priest to carry their wisdom. You need to live with your eyes open, your soul awake, your choices aligned with truth. That's how they move through you. That's how you become the continuation of their legacy. The gods are returning through your healing, through your courage to break the cycles, through your refusal to kneel to systems that never honored you, through your laughter that echoes like drums in the dark, through your tears that baptize the truth back into your bones, through your voice, unapologetic, ancestral, alive. And when you walk with that knowing, the world changes. Not all at once, but pulse by pulse, choice by choice. You become a lighthouse, not to lead others to you, but to remind them of their own light. The gods didn't choose a single prophet, they chose you, all of you. Because the return of the black gods is not about mythology, it's about memory, not about power, but presence. You are not alone, you never were, they've always been here. And now, with every breath you take in truth, with every lie you leave behind, you make room for them to rise again, not above you, but through you, as you. You were never meant to read this far, not according to them. They counted on your forgetfulness, on your fatigue, on your quiet surrender to the lies, but you made it here. And now the illusion is cracking, because the final secret, the one they buried deepest, is this. You are the living prophecy, not some messiah on a throne, not a voice in the clouds. You, the one reading these words, the one whose blood remembers what the mind forgot, the one they tried to silence before you ever spoke. You were not born broken. You were born encoded, with memory, with magic, with the map of galaxies written in your DNA. And that sacred code, it terrified them. That's why they rewrote your story, why they took your gods and painted them as beasts, why they called your mother tongue barbaric, why they branded your intuition as rebellion. Because if you ever found out who you really were, their whole system would fall. But the time of forgetting is over. The black gods are not returning from somewhere else. They are rising from within you. You are not following prophecy. You are fulfilling it. Every time you trust your dream, every time you heal what your lineage couldn't, every time you speak truth in a room that demands silence, you are undoing the spell. You are becoming what they feared, a sovereign soul, unshackled, unafraid, uncolonized. You see now, don't you? The old gods weren't destroyed. They became whispers and lullabies, codes and carvings, rhythms and footsteps. They waited for someone who could hear, someone who could remember, someone who could speak their names without shame. You are that someone. The prophecy was never about waiting. It was about waking. Let go of the fear they wrapped around your neck like scripture. Let go of the guilt they injected into your veins like doctrine. The divine never needed you to crawl, only to rise. You don't need a savior when you carry galaxies in your chest. You don't need permission to access the sacred. You are the sacred, the altar, the flame, the offering. This is your inheritance, not in gold, but in frequency, in fire, in the way your heart beats like a drum when truth is spoken. That's the signal. That's the gods rising. That's your ancestors clapping in the realm beyond, saying, yes, they made it. You are the answer to 1,000 generations of prayer. The echo of every black mother who whispered to her child, you are more than what they say. So take your place, not above, not below, but aligned, eyes wide open, feet grounded in memory, voice filled with the thunder of your own becoming. And when they ask who you are, don't just tell them your name, tell them your lineage. Tell them you are the God they tried to silence, the soul they couldn't steal, the prophecy they hoped would die. But here you are, breathing, burning, awake, and now the real story begins.